every day you and I get bombarded with negative news. Just like the body becomes what we eat, the mind becomes what we're putting in. It is important to listen to stories that not only gives you hope, but also inspires you and uplifts you. In this podcast, we're interviewing experts who will break down the solutions to the world's most pressing problems. And I promise you, if you listen to this podcast, you will not only stay informed, but you will also feel more energy in your life. Welcome to Great.com Talks with. Great.com is a philanthropic project where we're donating all the profit towards the most effective cause areas like protecting the rainforest, funding climate change technology. The topic of today is nuclear wars and how do we make sure that such a thing never happens. And to understand more about this, we invited Dr. Toon from University of Colorado Boulder. And one of Brian's specialties is the effect that nuclear weapons have on the atmosphere and the climate. So in this interview, we're going to talk about the nuclear situation. How does that look like right now? And what would happen if global war of nuclear weapons would be started? And what way forward do Brian see to prevent global nuclear war? So Brian, welcome to this interview.
Thank you.
Brian, if you describe the nuclear weapons, the power that exists today, and how powerful are they today, and how have they been developed over the past?
Sure. Well, nuclear weapons were first developed at the end of the Second World War, when two of them were used in Japan to bomb Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So in the Second World War, the United States originally was trying to do pinpoint bombing and bomb individual factories and things like that in Germany, for example. But that didn't work. And so the British and the United States ended up doing incendiary bombing, in which they were dropping small, little bitty bombs that were designed to go through the roofs of houses and buildings and burn them to the ground. And so they would send hundreds of airplanes over cities like Dresden and Hamburg. And, they did this in 60 cities in Japan, where they basically tried to burn the cities to the ground with all these fires. And so the point of a nuclear weapon was to burn entire cities down with one bomb and one airplane. So you didn't have to send 500 airplanes over a city and drop millions of little bombs. It's cheaper and didn't risk as much life loss to the pilots. So what nuclear weapons are is city killers. That's what they're designed to do, is to destroy cities.
That is a scary description. And how have them been developing up to today?
Sure. Well, they started off in small numbers, and the yields of nuclear weapons are measured in the equivalent weight of conventional bomb material. So like a kiloton nuclear weapon means it's the same power as 1,000 tons of conventional explosives, which is about as much as a single airplane can carry in a bomb, 1,000 tons or something like that. A typical nuclear weapon these days is about 300 kilotons. So if you dropped it on a city, it would destroy an area that's about 10 kilometers in diameter. So, most cities could be destroyed by one of these weapons. So one of the puzzles of all of this is that, for example, in Russia, there are only 200 cities with more than 100,000 people in them. And in the United States, there's about 300 cities with more than 100,000 people. Yet in 1985, when we had the largest number of nuclear weapons on the planet, there were 70,000 nuclear weapons. Why do you need 70,000 nuclear weapons to destroy 500 cities? You don't. They were bombing cities with tens of weapons. They just built them out of control for, it's not clear why. It's because people are making money by building them, or militaries were out competing each other without thought for what they were doing. And it's probably a lot of it is just people weren't thinking about what they were doing. In 1985, 1986, there was an agreement between Ronald Reagan, who was the president of the U.S. then, and Mikhail Gorbachev, who was a leader of the Soviet Union at the time, to start limiting nuclear weapons and getting rid of them. In fact, they wanted to get rid of all of them, but they weren't able to do that politically. But they reached an agreement to stop building so many nuclear weapons with short-range capabilities to attack Europe. Although that doesn't mean Europe is not involved in this. A lot of people may think, this is a U.S.-Russia problem. And those two countries have 90% of the weapons. But there's plenty of other nuclear weapons countries, including France and Britain, China, India, Pakistan, North Korea, Israel, all of whom have around 300 nuclear weapons or so. But nevertheless, in the mid-1980s, they were trying to stop a lot of short-range missiles being built, although now Russia is thought to have about 2,000 nuclear weapons, airplanes, ships, and things like that, whose purpose is primarily to attack Europe. So Europe is certainly a major target in the nuclear war, and there are nuclear weapons in several European countries, including Belgium, Italy, Turkey. Those would all be clear targets, but Britain and France have their own nuclear weapons. They would be targets. I just finished making a list of what I would think would be targets in Europe, which would include large power plants, oil refineries, a couple of hundred NATO bases and military bases of those countries. Those would all be targeted in a war. At any rate, since 1985, every American president and every Russian president has reduced the nuclear armament. So now we're down to 14,000 nuclear weapons. But we don't need 14,000 nuclear weapons. In a bizarre political twist of fate, the current treaties don't even deal with most of the weapons. They only deal with about 4,000 so-called strategic nuclear weapons that are deployed. So they restrict the number of deployed missiles or bombs. Deployed means they're sitting on top of a missile that's ready to be launched, or they're outside someplace where an airplane can carry them and bomb something. Strategic means that, they're long-range missiles, although it's not a very clear definition. At any rate, Russia and the United States each are allowed to have about 2,000 of those, but they each have another 2,000 in storage, which is unregulated, and they each have thousands more that are supposedly being dismantled. That's unregulated. And of course, there's no regulations on Britain, France, and these other countries that have nuclear weapons. So it's interesting that the United Nations has recently ratified an agreement outlawing nuclear weapons. So for a long time, landmines and chemical weapons and biological weapons have been considered to be outlawed by the United Nations. And now nuclear weapons are in that same category, so it's illegal to possess them. It's illegal to help another country build them. It's illegal to give advice to someone about how to make them. So this is an interesting turn of fate, a new attempt to limit them. And of course, none of the nuclear powers have signed on to this treaty, but more than 50 other countries around the world have.
I guess that is part of the job that needs to be done, that the countries needs to agree upon, starting to even bring down the numbers even more. Are you saying that who has access to even fire away a nuclear? If there's so many out there, could just people who have access to the system, could they fire away a nuclear, or is it only like the president of a country who can do that?
Well, this probably varies between the different countries, but the scary part of it is that in the United States and Russia, a single person can decide to have a nuclear attack. So, for example, the American president by himself could decide to use a large fraction of the missiles. And the reason that this is done is because a lot of the American missiles are sitting in silos on the land, and they're very obvious targets. Everybody knows where they are. You can look them up on the web. So they're very easy to attack. And unlike submarines, which can just sit under the ocean and wait to make sure that there's a reason to use their missiles, or bombers, which could be recalled after they take off, these missiles in the ground, once you decide to use them, you're committed. They're going where they're going. And this is not hypothetical. I mean, they're pointed at specific places. Like I know in a little town I'm in, Boulder, Colorado, which has about 100,000 people, that there are several nuclear weapons almost certainly aimed at right where I'm sitting at the moment, because there's a bunch of big federal laboratories here that are very important for like GPS navigation of where things are, or weather prediction, that sort of thing. So the obvious targets here. Russia has enough weapons to attack every town with 100,000 people in it with about 9 nuclear weapons. Of course, they wouldn't need to use 9 nuclear weapons on Boulder. One weapon would take care of the town. They could use the rest of them in some bigger city. But nevertheless, because of these weapons in the ground, it takes about 30 minutes for a Russian missile to leave Russia and land in the United States. So an American president has 30 minutes, if he's warned that the Russians have launched their missiles, to launch the American missiles. So there isn't very much likelihood that Russia is going to attack the United States, or the United States is going to attack Russia in some unprovoked way. I mean, the leaders know the dangers of these weapons. But nevertheless, there have been a number of accidental detections, and people have thought the other side launched their missiles. And in a situation like that, the president is being told, the Russians have launched their missiles. You have 20 minutes to decide to respond or not. And in one case, this went all the way up to the leader of the Soviet Union, decided that the announcement of a launch by the U.S. was an error, and so he didn't do anything. But there have been numerous near accidents of that sort. For example, once there was a little rocket launched from Sweden that was a scientific rocket, and the Russians took this as the beginning of a rocket launch. And there are other cases where new detection systems were put in place to detect launches, and they accidentally saw something they thought was a launch and reported it as a launch. And fortunately, somebody said, no, this is probably a mistake, and it isn't right, and don't do anything. So this is an extremely dangerous situation to be in. We're always 20 minutes from a nuclear war, and it's up to a single individual. I mean, there are concerns with Donald Trump, for example, that he might be crazy and launch the missiles. If he decided to launch the missiles, he could not be stopped. That would break the military protocols. If they're ordered to launch the missiles, they launch the missiles. Everywhere the president of the United States goes, there's a military officer with a thing called the football, just a briefcase with nuclear launch codes in it. So the president can launch those missiles at any time. And in fact, when the Capitol was invaded in January the 6th, the Vice President Pence has a football also, and it was not clear where that was for a while, and whether one of the invaders of the Capitol might have captured it. So there's a lot of dangers here about these accidental losses. But I think the other thing that people don't realize is that, in the military, what they know that when a weapon blows up, it's going to destroy things by the blast, and they can calculate how much damage will happen. But that isn't really what does the damage. For example, in Hiroshima, most of the damage was caused by a firestorm. So nuclear weapons are like bringing a piece of the sun down to the earth. There's a bright flash of light when they go off, which is so powerful that it can ignite trees and grasses and easily lit things, which can then start fires everywhere. And these fires occur over a much bigger region than the blast does. So we expect that the blast itself will kill many millions of people. For example, we just did an evaluation of a war between India and Pakistan, which are thought by 2025 to have around 500 nuclear weapons. And it's a very dangerous situation there because of the constant conflict in India and Pakistan over Kashmir. At any rate, we evaluated a war there involving attacks on cities with about half of their weapons, and concluded that somewhere between 50 and 125 million people would die just from the bomb blasts. 50 to 125 million people. And so if there were a war between Russia and Europe and the United States, hundreds of millions of people would likely die from these bomb blasts. But that's not the worst part of it. The worst part of it is these fires. And so the fires, there's a lot of fuel in cities. There's lots of stuff to burn. And that produces a huge amount of smoke. And we've seen large fires in forests before. They're not very common. Most forest fires are long lines that are very narrow. They might be a few hundred meters across and many kilometers long, but they're very narrow. But sometimes you get an area fire in which a whole large area is burning. And that's a different kind of fire because you've got a hot bubble of air produced by that that's physically as large as the atmosphere is deep. So that makes the smoke go up into the stratosphere. And nuclear weapons do that because they light fires in a circle around where the bomb hit. They might start 100 square kilometers on fire. That's something that's bigger than the atmosphere is deep. It would all that smoke go into the stratosphere. And we've observed forest fires to do this in the last couple of years. So what's so concerned about that is that if you put all this smoke into the upper atmosphere, it's above rainfall. It won't get washed out. So it'll sit up there for years. And for example, in a war between the United States and Russia, we expect so much smoke to be put into the stratosphere that it would destroy the ozone layer because it would heat the upper atmosphere by 100 degrees centigrade. And it would cool the ground because it absorbs sunlight above the surface instead of letting it get to the ground. And that would cool the ground so much that at mid-latitudes, you would have a nuclear winter. What a nuclear winter means is that every day for a couple of years in places like the Ukraine or Iowa, which are the breadbaskets of these two places, it would not get above freezing for a couple of years. So it's not like, it's freezing in September and freezing in April and the rest of the summer is good to grow. No, it's sort of like the war happens, the temperatures almost immediately drop below freezing, and they stay below freezing for the next summer, the next winter, the next summer, the next winter, the next summer. It doesn't get above freezing at all. So you're not going to grow anything in Europe, most of Russia and Canada, lots of the United States in a situation like that. So that would destroy the food supply and people would start starving to death. And this is not a problem that's limited just to the US and Russia. We've analyzed a war between India and Pakistan in which they used half their arsenals. I just mentioned you could kill as many as 125 million people in that. But the smoke from the burning cities would go into the upper atmosphere. It would again heat the stratosphere enough to destroy a large fraction of the ozone layer, exposing people to ultraviolet radiation. You probably wouldn't be able to walk out of your house for more than tens of minutes if you were a Caucasian person without getting badly sunburned. And it would drop temperatures, not so dramatically. It wouldn't be a nuclear winter. You wouldn't be having freezing temperatures everywhere. But it would be colder than normal. And so the growing season would be shortened. And what we find in this is that you lose crops like maize and wheat, and maize and wheat in particular. You lose 20 or 30% of the productivity of those crops. And particularly in areas which are already cold, like Europe and Russia, in southern Canada and the east coast of the United States, those places would not be able to grow anywhere near as much material as they do now. And this would cause starvation across the world. And so lots of people have read this biblical story about the Pharaoh in Egypt. It's also a story in the Quran about the Pharaoh in Egypt storing up food in good years to feed the Egyptians in bad years. And he has 7 years of the grain in storage. Well, the modern world has 60 days or so of grain in storage to feed the world. So modern agriculture works by continually having new plants growing in some part of the world and transportation so that there's plenty of food to eat. But in reality, in a typical city, there's only enough food for about a week. It has to be brought in every week. There's only enough food in the whole planet for 60 days feeding the population. If it suddenly becomes cold and you can't grow stuff, people are going to start starving to death very quickly. Others, we haven't predicted this, but other people have predicted that 1 billion people would die following a war between India and Pakistan by starvation. And they wouldn't be in India and Pakistan, they'd be all over the world. In fact, Russia and Northern Europe is uniquely vulnerable to this because they don't have much of a growing season normally because they're at high latitudes. Cool it off a little more, it'll be very difficult for them to grow crops. So it's really this environmental assault that's the danger to the rest of the world outside the region where the war itself occurs. A cheerful thought. I can see you're taking breaths to calm down.
Yeah, this is pretty damn scary things that you're talking about. I feel almost hopeless just hearing that this is down to a misunderstanding. You're saying that if someone would misunderstand that, if Russia would believe that there's a missile coming because their computer is saying that this is happening, then that could lead to them starting this, and then it's just...
Absolutely. The most likely event is an accidental war. I mean, there's other things that people have hypothesized. For example, a lot of people in the Baltic states, Estonia, for example, and those countries are worried about Russia invading them like they did the Ukraine. And the Ukraine was not a NATO country, but the Baltic states are NATO countries. And so in a situation like that, NATO is pledged to defend them. So you could have something like that spin out of control. Russia might think, oh, we wouldn't do anything for fear of a nuclear war. And, which is, people have thought that several times about the U.S., like that's what people in Afghanistan thought, that if they blew up the World Trade Center, we wouldn't do anything, which has led to 20 years of war. So if Russia decided to try to go retake the Baltic countries and make them again part of some Soviet empire, that could lead to a nuclear conflict. It probably would take a little while to develop, but it might be accidental again. It might be, the Soviet Union or Russia sends in conventional troops to take over the Baltics, and we respond with conventional troops, and then somebody accidentally shoots somebody, and then somebody shoots more people, and the whole thing erupts. So you could have conflicts develop that way as well. But it's more likely that, Russians are very intelligent people. They understand how the world works. And, Americans actually probably don't really understand Russia very well. In the Second World War, Russia lost about 30 million people because they were invaded by Germany. And, the United States lost 300,000 people. So the Russians, lost 100 times as many people in the Second World War. And, they were previously invaded by France with Napoleon, and they fought wars all over the time with Sweden. So Russia's got a lot of bad experiences having wars. So it's pretty unlikely that the Russian politicians, would try to engage in some sort of a conflict with NATO for fear that it would spin out of control. So it's much more likely we would have a war by accident because they thought we had launched our missiles for some reason. And again, that's probably situational in the sense, Putin is not likely to wake up tonight and think we've suddenly launched missiles. But if, there was some conflict going on, like in the Baltics, and we didn't know what was going to happen, and some Ukrainian thing was happening with a lot of motions of troops, and NATO was moving toward that border, and then they suddenly thought there was a launch by mistake, that might lead to an accidental war. This almost happened here a few years ago. We were being threatened by North Korea that they were going to launch missiles at the United States, and somebody in Hawaii mistakenly put on a broadcast to Hawaii saying they were under attack by missiles. And people in Hawaii, of course, panicked about this because they thought North Korea had been threatening us to launch missiles, and maybe they did. And, it was just a mistake. Somebody pushed the wrong button in some warning system that they were testing and broadcast this incorrect message. But, if you have an accident like that in a time when there's a lot of tension, that could spin out of control. So how do we stop this?
Yeah, that's a good question. How do we stop this?
The way we need, so right now, my little group, maybe we have about 20 people that are working on these problems, is trying to communicate to people that there's a danger here and we need to build down these nuclear weapons to much lower levels and eventually get rid of them, not build them up, but not build even more weapon systems. We could use that money for lots of other things in the world, like, educating children, and, universities are not free in the United States like they are in much of Europe. And we could use it to educate people at universities. We could build better health care. We could build lots of better things than a bunch of worthless missiles that are sitting in the ground doing nothing. So there's a lot of better things to do than build these things. So the challenge here, of course, is that if you have a science problem, and this is a science problem, usually there'll be thousands of scientists around the world working on it, trying to understand it, and trying to warn the political establishments in their countries about the danger. But in this case, we have this problem, which is a worldwide concern. Nuclear weapons could affect all of us. They could cause a huge fraction of the world population to die from starvation. And nobody's studying the problem, which is largely because the militaries don't want people to study this problem. There's no funding to study the problem. And scientists are leery of studying the problem because they don't want to get into some sort of trouble for studying something that's a politically hot topic and involves the military. So that's a very bad situation. You really need the science community around the world to get engaged in this problem and warn their leaders about the difficulties. And this is what happened in the mid-1980s. Nuclear winter was discovered in the early 1980s by a group of people I worked with, including Carl Sagan. And Sagan was very good at communicating at that time with the public. And he was able to warn people in the United States, politicians, of this danger. And Ronald Reagan, who was a son of a Trumpish kind of figure, but Ronald Reagan actually understood this message. He understood how a nuclear war could produce all this smoke and produce climate changes, which caused mass starvation. He, gave lectures before the agreement with Gorbachev, clearly indicating he understood it. And at the same time, we were able to engage Russian scientists, and the Russian scientists did calculations of their own. And they were convinced, obviously, Gorbachev of the same thing, that that it wasn't just American propaganda, that this was a real problem. And Gorbachev obviously understood this as well, which is why they agreed. Gorbachev said, "Oh, well, people of morality have to act in this situation and remove this danger from the world." Reagan made similar comments. So we need to have that happen again. We need to have the world science community advise their governments about the dangers of these weapons. And this has sort of happened with the United Nations. They reached this treaty saying we have to get rid of these weapons, they're dangerous. But we need to have a broader community of science people advising their governments to do something about this. I frequently get actually messages from young people in Europe saying, what can they do about this problem? And I normally advise them, well, they should go get involved with ICAN, which is the organization that caused this treaty to be organized in the United Nations. There are probably things they could do locally working with that in that framework. But they also should, think about going to college in some area of science or politics or international affairs or something like that, whatever they like. Some people like science, some people like international affairs. And use that background to try to make changes in the world that will solve some of these worldwide problems we have. It's not just nuclear weapons. We need to solve the greenhouse problem and climate change problem and the massive inequities in the world and how much money people have to live on and things like that. There are lots of problems to solve. And, young people can solve them, but they need to be prepared to do it, and they need to get involved with the organizations that are trying to do that now.
Brian, you live in America, and you've been studying this for so long now, and being all. What I'm trying to say is, my question is, during President Trump, he was almost denying climate change, and it seems like it was very hard to give him feedback, and he had that access to just push a button, and he several times he kind of tweeted that he would threaten people with nuclear weapons. You must have been scared knowing the impacts of nuclear weapons with a leader like that.
Yeah, well, that was a great concern about, what was actually motivating him and what was he actually likely to do. It was very difficult to understand Donald Trump. It's very difficult, actually, for me to understand why so many people like Donald Trump. It's just hard to imagine why he has such a big fan club. But, nevertheless, one has hope that the American system is supposed to be self-correcting. It's supposed to recognize a problem if it's there, and everybody fights and argues about it. There's a lot of debate about everything that happens here. Typical of most democracies, that's the value of democracy. It isn't like everybody agrees on what to do when they get together, but they usually agree on what the problems are. And, then they argue about the solutions. And so that's what you expect to happen in the United States, is that if there's a problem, then people will argue about the problem and they'll find a solution and solve it. And people solved it, they voted him out of office. Of course, it was a close thing. I think the United States has a close call with dictatorship there, which is incredibly surprising. But nevertheless, yes, it was a scary time, but the system worked in the end, and I think we're in a much calmer situation now, where perhaps we have a leader who will listen to the advice of experts instead of just doing whatever he feels like doing.
Yeah. We're getting towards the end here, and I would like to want to leave some space Is there anything else that you think is important that people understand about nuclear weapons and the situation that we are facing?
Well, I think people have been ignoring nuclear weapons for a long time, myself included. And after the mid-1980s, we had communicated this information to Gorbachev and Reagan, and the Bush administrations understood it, and nuclear weapons were dropping. And when the Soviet Union fell apart, which was a magnificent revolution, a peaceful revolution, overturning of an entire philosophical system for world government, it was amazing that overturned. And I think people stopped worrying about nuclear wars in about 1992 when it appeared there would be friendship across the world and many of the tensions would be relieved. And they have been relieved to a large extent. But they didn't go away. There's still nuclear weapons there. And things haven't worked out that well with Russia. It's not really a democracy. And, it's really a dictatorship there. And it's hard to know how it's going to evolve. And it doesn't seem to be doing very well economically. It's going to do worse economically as fossil fuels are phased out. And in fact, global climate change is a major issue here that, Europe has been under a lot of pressure because of immigration, and that's just going to get worse and worse and worse. By the end of this century, there's going to be a lot of parts of the tropics that are not habitable because it will be so hot that people won't be able to really function there. And, those people are going to move north into Europe and into the United States. And there is going to be a huge immigration flow, much larger than the historically large one we've been having in the last few years. And that's going to produce all sorts of conflicts. So we have to figure out how to deal with those conflicts now in advance and stop them from happening. So this, to me, is the biggest challenge we face, is that we can't just ignore these problems. We haven't really ever dealt with the nuclear weapons. We've just ignored them. And they're not going away. And in fact, tension levels have risen because of the Russian takeover of Crimea and various other actions of aggression by the Russians. So that's those tensions at a high point now. And so we have to deal with the nuclear weapons, but we also have to deal with climate change and economic inequalities because it's driving massive immigration. That's going to lead to more conflicts in the future, and there's a potential for more countries to get nuclear weapons. We definitely do not want nuclear weapons to spread to even more countries. This has been a long time fear of people that large numbers of countries would have nuclear weapons, and instead of just the United States and Russia facing off, you'd have other countries with different goals, and they wouldn't even agree on the goals. It'd be hard to know whose side. And we're very close to in the Middle East. If Iran were to build nuclear weapons, and Egypt would feel it had to have them, and Saudi Arabia would have to have them, Israel already has them. You could have 5 or 6 nuclear countries in the Middle East very easily, and who would even know who's on whose side? It's very complicated there. So we don't want that kind of situation to arise. Because even small numbers of nuclear weapons, like who would imagine that India and Pakistan between them now have about 300 nuclear weapons? Pakistan, if it keeps its current rate of development up, will be the 3rd leading nuclear power by the end of the decade by the number of missiles it has. Does that make sense? Why does Pakistan need all those weapons? What are they going to do with them? Why don't they invest them in something else that helps their population better? So we definitely do not want proliferation of more countries with more nuclear weapons, or at least more difficult to control. And, there's a lot of issues there about how do countries feel safe without nuclear weapons. So it's not an easy problem to solve.